Imagine living in a world so brutal that most of your friends wouldn't survive to blow out the candles on their 13th birthday. Seriously. Welcome to the absolutely terrifying existence of our earliest ancestors. Look, humanity, belonging to the genus Homo, has traveled an extraordinary distance over 2.8 million years. We live in a world with incredible tech that has pushed the global life expectancy to about 73 years, but reaching that milestone required enduring countless tribulations, often inflicted by our own species, evidenced by the shockingly short lifespans throughout history. We, Homo sapiens, the modern folks, had it relatively comfortable compared to earlier human species. You need to stop right now and genuinely appreciate that advantage, because existence as a primitive human was frequently nothing short of horrifying. Paleontologists constantly find early human remains that prove our ancestors died truly gruesome deaths. We're going to focus on one specific population that had it particularly rough: Homo habilis. These guys lived 2 million years ago, and they had it so devastatingly difficult that most individuals kicked the bucket before adolescence. Their average lifespan? A depressing 12 years. That's 6 times shorter than today's global average. So the big, urgent question is, why were their lives so unbelievably terrible? Tragically for them, literally every single factor worked against their survival, including their own physical anatomy. First, let's talk size. Habilis was one of the smallest humans ever documented, potentially averaging below 4 feet. Being a tiny human on a planet full of gigantic killers? Not ideal. That diminutive stature made them extremely susceptible to physical trauma, and it didn't help that their skeletal framework lacked any significant robustness to compensate for their size disadvantage. They were built like twigs. They were also partially arboreal, meaning they spent considerable time up in elevated tree environments. Now, given that chimpanzees commonly experience at least one major fall throughout their existence, the same reasoning applies to Homo habilis. Since they possessed inferior climbing adaptations compared to modern chimps, you can bet they sustained at least one severe falling injury during their lifetime. Ouch. You'd think a small hominin would stick to leaves and fruit, but nope. Homo habilis actually displayed among the highest meat consumption levels observed in human species. Admittedly, they also consumed substantial quantities of fruit and vegetation, but that meat-heavy diet inevitably forced them to regularly abandon the safety of the trees. Even worse, their preference for fish drew them near water sources, and consequently the horrors lurking within. If you were Homo habilis in East or South Africa, your daily existence was a constant, persistent threat. You were surrounded by numerous large carnivores that routinely appeared to contest scavenged remains. Rest assured, daily existence meant living under the persistent threat of being eliminated by an incredibly diverse array of different carnivores. Mind you, each one possessed its own unique, horrifying method to dispatch you. At least, there was some variety in your impending doom, I suppose. One of the most common threats lurking nearby would have been Megantereon. It was basically a jaguar-sized saber-toothed cat that inhabited Africa throughout the entire span of habilis existence. But wait, it was way worse than a jaguar. Despite the resemblance, it was more heavily constructed and alarmingly possessed lower limbs that were actually lion-sized. These limbs featured enormous paws terminating in razor-sharp, recurved claws, prepared to embed right into the flesh of any unsuspecting Homo habilis. To compound the threat, there was also Homotherium and Macrodus lurking in the environment. This is exceptionally unfortunate, as the latter happened to be among the largest felids ever documented. Certain species could hit 405 kilograms. That's comparable to both Smilodon and a massive male polar bear. At that magnitude, even a well-placed paw strike could instantly eliminate an individual, especially since numerous victims appear to have been targeted during youth. Another predator family that relished consuming our ancestors were hyenas. Similar to the cats, multiple different hyena species targeted hominins, but 2 really stood out: Chasmoporthetes and Pachycrocuta. In typical unlucky habilis fashion, Pachycrocuta happened to be among the largest hyenas throughout history. Then when you factor in that Pachycrocuta likely hunted in packs, you suddenly have a complete serving and a half of death. If captured, you'd also have to worry about the fact that in many situations, hyenas will literally consume their prey alive, which is something I, at least personally, would prefer to avoid. But as terrible as those guys sound, they were nothing compared to what lurked in the waters of the Homo habilis environment: giant crocodiles. In other words, a nightmare for our ancestors, considering that they had a preference for fishing, and not with a fishing rod or spear, but rather with their bare hands. The most notable kinds during that era belonged to the same genus of crocodile alive today, Crocodylus. One particular species was Crocodylus anthropophagus, literally man-eating crocodile. As you can imagine, at this gargantuan size, Anthropophagus surely had one killer bite, which, along with its human diet, makes it come off as one pretty devilish creature. And of course, prehistoric cats, hyenas, and giant crocs were just the tip of the iceberg. You also had many predators around that are still alive today, including various panthera, canids, birds of prey, and snakes. Snakes especially were likely another major component in explaining Homo habilis' short lifespan. Despite no direct evidence of attacks being known, we do know that, in general, snakes and hominids have a dicey relationship at best. To this day, snakes cause tens of thousands of deaths in Africa alone, with venomous snakes being the worst perpetrators. Plus, in uncontacted tribes, attacks by constricting snakes remain the highest source of mortality for specific groups. To make matters worse, despite not being a hominin, I have to mention the ape Dinopithecus. It was a giant primate, closely related to baboons. When considering the fact that it could have been 3 times the size of Homo habilis, we should probably add this guy to the already very long list of potential predators. It's believed that as the climate worsened, populations had to rely more and more on scavenging meat to supplement their caloric intake. This, in turn, led to, again, more deaths, as it brought them into contact with more predators who also would have been more violent, as they too felt the strains of a dying ecosystem. Ultimately, it was a very tough and unfair world to Homo habilis. One thing is clear: being a Homo habilis sucked.